Right. So we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 today. And as I mentioned, and I'll mention this again as we close out today, we're going to go through the first part of verse 21 today. And then next week, we'll go from 21, essentially 21b to chapter 12, verse 10. We'll get into Paul's vision and his thorn of flesh and see if anybody here has an answer to what that all meant. See if anybody has an idea. So let's go ahead and read today. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrain and will refrain from burdening you in any way, as the truth of Christ is in me. This boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows that I do. We'll stop there and pick back up in just a little bit. All right. So again, today we continue on with Paul's defense of his ministry. And the issue, of course, is that there are some folks who are backbiting back in Corinth. Folks who are looking to destroy a ministry that God himself has ordained, that's in God's name, and it's God's reputation that's at stake here. And this is the point of the course of the clash with David and Goliath, isn't it? David was concerned about not the armies, he was concerned about God's reputation and the fact that no one was willing to defend God's honor. And in some sense, that's what Paul's doing here, because it's God himself who's established the apostleship, who's established the mission, who's established the church. Paul just played the part as the ambassador or the minister of reconciliation and introducing the two, introducing Jesus to his new bride in Corinth. So if Paul does nothing, the church could be persuaded that the flaws that they see or saw due to the false apostles that are coming from behind and backbiting and pointing them out. He's afraid that the Corinthians might actually be settled on the opinion that those ideas are true. And so he's going to do his best to defend himself, even if he looks like a fool. If he doesn't, he loses the church he clearly loves and he cares for. If he does nothing, they just go on their merry way, not really following Christ anymore. So he's viewing this as the opportunity to set the record straight. So when he says, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolish, just do bear with me. The idea of bearing is the idea of mutual forbearance, to put up with. We all know what it's like to put up with someone or something. It might be a job, it might be a person, it might be a friend. Sadly, it might be the person you're married to. We all put up with different things. And that's the idea that Paul is actually encouraging the Corinthians to do, is to put up with him while he begins to tell them the truth about what the Corinthians backbiters are saying. Implicit in this idea, though, is that they are to do this putting up with somebody else because Christ, in fact, puts up with them. Again, imagine if your bride were unfaithful to you and yet you continued to stay with your bride, like you might find in Hosea. She would continue to go out and have affairs with these men, and Hosea would continue to bring her back. And that's the same idea that Paul's trying to insinuate here, is that Christ is putting up with you and your unfaithfulness by accusing me of being not really an apostle of God. That's a slander against God. And slander against God is essentially idolatry or adultery. I mean, it's really accusing God of being unfair, or being unwise, or being unfaithful, when in fact it's the Corinthians themselves who are being that. And Christ is, instead of removing the church and removing their lampstand. As we get to Revelation and find those things out, Jesus is putting up with it. And so Paul's kind of reminding them of that affair. And we'll use this idea of putting up with again in verse 4, and I won't go into such length of time, but it's used again in verse 4. He says he's divinely jealous. For I feel a divine jealousy for you. Again, we've mentioned many times Paul's interest in being with the Corinthians. He's been with them a year and a half in the beginning. He went back over to Ephesus on the next part of his mission journey. He goes back to Corinth for this painful visit. He's written painful letters. He's written 4 letters. He's coming up on his 3rd visit. He's continually interested in the Corinthians. He's sending his best people there in order to persuade them that they're on the wrong path. He's doing his best to get them back on the right path. And so he says, I feel a divine jealousy for you. And what's really funny is when you tear this apart, and they don't get this into the English, but the word jealousy actually appears twice in this sentence. And so what he's really saying, he says, jealousy here means a sense of dedication or loyalty. And by noting it as divine, he's really putting it upon the fact that his jealousy, his desire for the people of Corinth is from God himself. And jealousy is characterized not only as divine, but it's repeated twice. And as we've gone through our discussions on hermeneutics and language and so on, when you start to see words repeated 2 and 3 and 4 times, it's worth sitting up and take notice. And what Paul says effectively here is that I am jealously, divinely jealous for you. It's a repetition that it includes the depth of his emotion, or I should say the height of his emotion, is that he wants, not for him personally, but he wants the Corinthians to walk with the Lord. He wants the Corinthians to acknowledge that this is God's mission, and he wants the Corinthians to acknowledge that he is God's apostle. And he's jealously jealous for the Corinthians to be able to do that. That's his love for them really shining through. Again, I don't know how the Corinthians could escape the repetition and not be struck to their core. That here's a guy, you don't get the idea that the Corinthian false apostles are saying anything like this. They're busy spending their time denigrating or running down Paul with different opinions and different thoughts. And, they're running down his speech and how ugly he is and all the different aspects of his ministry they don't like. They're not really doing anything to lift up Christ. And what Paul is doing exactly the opposite. He's not, he'll take care of the Corinthian accusations, but he's trying to say, this is God's mission. This is God's sending of me to you. This is me, by God's grace and by God's plan, me introducing you to Jesus. This is all for God's glory. And so they can't help but miss that that's the core of Paul's motivation. So it isn't a pretty, or it's not a throwaway word. He's telling them how he feels from his heart. And he's asking the question subtly, do the apostles, these false apostles you're listening to, do they feel the same way? And the rhetorical question is, the answer is expected is no, they don't feel the same way. They're in it for themselves. They're in it for either their money or their glory that they get themselves. And this is what we notice about people who cause schisms or splits. There's likely one group that he has in mind here. There likely is one group that has in mind the church. Another group is only concerned about themselves. It's more complicated than that when church splits happen. And I've been through a few. It's more complicated than that. But generally speaking, one group is up for themselves, and the other group is up for what's it going to do to the church and to the people. So he continues on as he's again kind of putting them in their place. When he says, I am jealously jealous for you, since I betrothed you to one's husband. And Paul envisions himself really here as the father of the congregation who's promised the church in marriage to Jesus as the bridegroom. The father was to guard the purity of the bride up until the time of their marriage, but in essence, as an agent of the bridegroom. In other words, the father is not an agent for himself to be able to get the dowry or give the dowry. The father is an agent of the bridegroom to keep the bridegroom pure. So again, think about the implications of that. We can think about what Mary ends up pregnant and Joseph is going, yeah, but she's pregnant. What's up with that? Where's the father in that kind of situation? Those are the things going through Joseph's mind when he finds out she's pregnant. Again, coming over now to the Corinthian church, Paul views himself as that father. I introduced you. I arranged the marriage, if you will. And he's concerned about the purity of the bride. And if the father doesn't do that, essentially the whole deal falls apart. Now, again, someone doesn't walk in salvation, someone isn't saved and then unsaved. But what you can say is that by someone's actions, they reveal who they are. And if they continue down this path, they reveal that they're really not in Christ. And so that's where Paul's utter concern comes from. All right, continuing on verses 3 and 4. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. And so verse 3 really becomes that explanation of jealousy. Notice that Paul is again comparing himself to the false apostles, not by direct comparison, but by insinuation. He's essentially calling them equivalent of agents of Satan. So he's not getting to mincing words of, he's not saying, these are believers necessarily, but he's getting to where they're sons of the God of this world, not the sons of the God of the universe. He is openly stating his motive for correcting the Corinthians and the apostles, not so much. Paul throws them in the same league with Satan, who deceived Eve. And in this retelling of the story, the church is Eve and the false apostles are the cunning serpent. And if the Corinthians listen, they will be led astray like Eve was led astray. So in the passive role of listening, it's this passive role of listening that Paul is concerned. In other words, envision the scenario where these false apostles have come in after Paul's gone back to Ephesus. And Paul's busy, touring the Adriatic Sea or the Aegean Sea. Paul's busy touring, so he's really not with us. These false apostles have come in. They're maligning Paul's ministry, which is a maligning God. And the Corinthians are going, I never thought about it that way. You might have a point there. And it's not necessarily even everybody, but it's enough that it's causing a stir and an issue between the people in Corinth, right? So what Paul is concerned is that the Corinthians are just bearing with the false news that they're hearing. They're putting up with it. They're not saying, no, this is wrong. This is against everything we heard or believe. They're saying, I never thought about it that way. And they did just that. Exactly. There's pictures of them. They're putting up with everything that they're hearing, not pushing back at all. Right? So it's the passive role that's the concern. So Paul characterizes their confusion as they let their thoughts be led astray. And isn't this the same issue that they put up with somebody else's sin back in 1 Corinthians when they found out that someone was sleeping with their late father's wife, right? And what are they doing about it? They're going, well, it might be a sin, but we were saved by grace. He's probably saved by grace. We're going to put up with it today. And Paul says, what are you thinking? The purity of the church is at stake. Who do you think you are, living like the heathen? In some sense, it's the same lackadaisical view towards what does God tell us to do that Paul's concerned about with the Corinthians. So the idea again of you put up with it here, it's the same word as back in verse 1, and it's sort of it's a sort of a play on words. You put up with a different Jesus, he says. These are condemning words. So Paul, in almost in staccato fashion, he says, for if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, that's number one. Or if you receive a different spirit, number two, from the one you received. Or number three, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. You bear with it readily enough. These are condemning words. You're listening to a different Jesus than the one we introduced to you. You're responding to a different spirit than the one you received. You're responding to a different gospel. And if you think about the impact of listening to a different gospel, then there's the potential for these people not being saved because they're showing themselves as caretakers of something different. You put up with a different spirit, a different gospel. Down in verse 19, you put up with fools. And Paul subtly asks the question, but you won't put up with me? Where's your love, essentially? Where's your love of me? Where's your love of God who's given me this ministry? Where's your love of all the things that we've taught? He's really questioning, he's not so much questioning your salvation, but he's coming right up to the edge, if you will. Because he's saying the things you're listening to, the things you're bearing with, they have the danger of you falling into a pit of remorse, if you will. right? Remember how Paul treats the different gospel situation in Galatians. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 6-8. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. And if you recall that passage, he says the exact same thing again. Now, the copyist didn't stutter. He didn't copy a line twice just by mistake, but Paul's repeating it for emphasis that it's not the same gospel at all. In fact, it's a gospel that leads to damnation. So these are serious ideas that the Corinthians are putting up with, that they're listening to, and they're not putting their hand up. They're not saying, talk to the hand. The face isn't listening. Earlier to the Corinthians, Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 2, and when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and in power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So you take 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and he's saying that these false apostles are not proclaiming to you the same gospel. They're not giving you the same Spirit. They're giving you a different gospel, which in fact is a gospel of damnation. And if you listen to it and follow that path, it shows who you really were. And I think more of you than that. I think more of you than that, such that I'm willing to send my best men, Titus and these two other brothers, to you to help rectify and clarify these points. So Paul is showing the exact opposite of putting up with something. Rather, he's confronting the evil that he sees and he hears, because it's tearing apart the church. Someone's salvation is at stake. This is a matter of about what and in whom they believe. Someone's salvation is at stake. These are quite serious. And now he gets down to the spot where he calls them these super apostles. These super apostles are preaching details that are different from the actual Jesus's life and death. They want a showy Jesus, a Jesus who's assigned showy titles and statuses now, one who's not timid or meek. And this is different, I think, than the error of the Galatian churches, but it's lethal nonetheless. So these are serious issues that Paul's really charging them with. So we get to verse 5. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. So consider the word we saw in abundance last week, the idea of the work of the mind to face facts and come to a rational conclusion, where we talked about the word rational or understand. Paul uses it, Paul picks up that thought again here. He says, I consider, that is, with my mind, I know the facts, and I come to a settled conclusion that I am not inferior to those apostles you're comparing me to. Right? Inferior is like they're the super apostles or the false apostles. And that's Paul's choice of, I think those are actually their words for Paul. And Paul's flipping the tables a little bit. They're accusing Paul of having inferior planning skills, of inferior appearance, inferior speech. They view him being lower in status, even though he's as he would proclaim elsewhere, he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He didn't have the social status that these super apostles did when they come in. The idea of being inferior means that he means that he needs nothing to compensate for some deficiency exhibited by a comparison with them. That is, when he compares himself with them and he knows he's on God's mission, partly what happened on Damascus and everything since then, Paul's on a mission direct from God. And when he compares what he does and the way that he declared God to them, both in power and works and wonders, versus how they're doing works, they're busy just talking. Not that talking's bad. I mean, otherwise I should just close up shop now and we go home. But they're just talking. They're not doing any specific things to say this message is from God. They're just comparing themselves to themselves and finding everybody else deficient. When we get to the idea of super apostles, we'll have much more to say when we get to verse 13. So we'll leave that to then. But in the second half of 6, even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plain to you in all things. Paul sort of admits that he's not so skilled in speaking, or at least he's being modest here. Now, which again, you think of Acts chapter 4, when being unskilled is the idea of a person who's relatively unskilled or inexperienced in some activity, like a layperson or an amateur. Yeah.
But on Mars Hill, he sounded very good.
True, he sounded good, but he didn't sound polished and official.
Well, the note here says he was lacking the rhetoric.
Correct.
Yes.
So that's what the super apostles are looking for, is this skilled idea of logic, proving a point, coming up with evidence, and making their case known.
Okay, yes.
And so that's where their idea. It's a good point. It's the right point. He's quite skilled at, with power, declaring Jesus had risen from the dead. But what he's not doing is doing it in the way that the Corinthian false apostles would like to have it done. Okay. All right. So Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. What he's saying is that they didn't recognize that Peter and Paul were uneducated by their accent, as if they were from Kentucky or something. They recognized they were uneducated by the manner in which they argued. And it didn't occur to me till I thought it was an accent or something like that for years. But I think, given the way that these things lock together, this is their method of argumentation. And what they look to do is look to the Old Testament and say, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and Jesus is the fulfillment of this, and this, and this, and this. And that's not a rhetorical way to argue at all. And so what Paul's saying, this is not, we're quite skilled in knowledge. I can talk from the Old Testament, all that Jesus talked about himself. And I can bring that conclusion, and you can see by the fruits, in fact, in your heart, that you become convinced of that. I don't need the rhetorical skill to make a point, to bring salvation. It wasn't like someone is saying, yeah, regarding Jim and me, me and him went down to the grocery store the other day. They're not using language that sounds like they were raised on the streets. They're just using logic that's not the same as the Greeks had purported. So by their speech, their training could be understood. And Paul is not ignorant, just untrained like his accusers. And that's part of the reason, the commentators I was reading and what I think, that's part of the reason I think Paul's actually sending Titus. I think Titus is. So we'll get to the fact of Titus being able to perform miracles, I think, as well. Being an under apostle. He wasn't an apostle per se, but he's being sent at the behest of an apostle. I'm going to think that Titus ends up showing up and is able to conduct himself with logic and with power and with the reasoning from the Old Testament as well. So in essence, what Paul's saying is he's not a skilled debater, someone who would present evidence, and the argument and the audience would determine if the speaker had won the day. But again, if you remember the scene, back to Gina's point, you remember the scene in Acts where Paul was speaking with the Areopagus. Paul did in fact debate publicly, and many were persuaded. So it wasn't the fact that you can only persuade people if you use this rhetorical style. It was the fact that God's Spirit used these facts through Paul to bring people to salvation. So in contradiction, then, Paul makes up for his lack of polished words with his knowledge. By Paul's point of view, the knowledge surpassed his rhetorical skill, which likely used a turn of phrase to cover up a lack of knowledge. In other words, they said things in a really fancy way, like they would obfuscate things. Everybody know what obfuscate means? I see no hand, huh?
What's the word?
Obfuscate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we got 2 people out of 20 who knows what obfuscate means, which is the part of the point. Use fancy words to cover up the fact that, to obfuscate just means to cover up, to hide, to mingle in with other things. And so they would use fancy words to cover up the fact that they were without knowledge. They might use some Greek style. So again, you see Paul's now getting to the point of he's not bearing with the Corinthians' complaints anymore. He's coming right at them and saying, this is leading us to it's leading you astray, and you're putting up with it. And the fact that you're doing up that, I started to have questions about, are you saved or not? He's really starting to, he knows he loves them. He knows he's introduced them to Jesus. He knows that many are, but he's thinking that there's a number of people who are listening to these Corinthian false apostles who in fact might not be. So that's where his concern comes into play. So Paul continues with this comparison again in verse 7. Comes to this point, he says, he uses some rhetorical questions to highlight the nature of his feelings for Corinthians. He says, did I commit a sin in humbling myself? Commit a sin here, the idea is of a mistake. It's not the sin like of the flesh, it's just an honest mistake. Almost the idea is a social sin or a faux pas. You know, I used my my meat fork instead of my salad fork, that kind of thing. You all know there's a difference, right? I didn't learn that. Just go left and keep coming in. That's all I know. A guy named Ben Witherington said, Paul wanted the gospel of Christ to come to the Corinthians as a gift, not as goods for which they paid. Paul's really saying, you know, because that's one of the things the Corinthians are saying is that they're not accepting money either. We like to be the sponsors of people because we're kind of highfalutin and high and mighty. We like to be the sponsors of people, so they appreciate us. And Paul's saying, I came to you free charge. I came to you with the gospel, and it's not for sale. Paul wanted to know this comes as a gift, not as a purchased item down at 7-Eleven. And he says to them, you know, he says, did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, or because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? He says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone. When he says I robbed other churches, robbing is almost the idea of carrying off booty or plunder. In other words, did I go off with them and I start packing up my 401k with money that I got in order so I could be with you free of charge, but I robbed them blind so that I could go off with my own wealth. You know, the common complaint that gets made about televangelists today is that they're in it for the money and in it for what they get. I have to laugh. You know, some of the people who are in charge of some of the Marxist social issues going on today, people who are Marxists who essentially want communism, who own 4 homes, you know, worth a total of about $4 or $5 million. Just seems disingenuous to me, just a little bit. You know, so Paul is saying, you know, here he was not out to, or nor did he amass a fortune like some train robber in accepting support from others, but rather he did it so that he could offer the gospel as a gift to the Corinthians. And I think Paul might have had some idea, and this is the thought that occurs to me as you read this and you start to, you know, pour through the commentaries. And this is not anything anybody said, but you start to get the idea that Paul might have been concerned that the way the Corinthian people thought of themselves in their culture completely was this idea of they thought themselves as sponsors of others, which is why you see back in 1 Corinthians itself, you know, am I not a Paul? Am I not a Cephas? I'm not Apollos. They like the idea of sponsoring their favorite preacher. And you know, here's Pastor so-and-so. I have to, I'm amused sometimes as well when you start to watch this humble brag that happens on Twitter sometimes. I'm just honored to be over here at church so-and-so, you know, which happens to be the largest church in Houston. I just happen to be, you know, honored to be here preaching so-and-so. It's like constantly this idea of bragging wherever you are. I got invited to here. I got invited to here. And I know some of them. I actually know some of the people that I see that, and that's not their heart, but it comes across that way a little bit. But he was not out to amass his own fortune. He was out to give them the free gift. His refusal to accept support from them is not intended to dishonor them in any way. Their failure to understand Paul's willing acceptance of his own humiliation is a misunderstanding of Paul's ministry. Paul was willing to have a lesser standard of living and go without so that they might have the gospel for free. Paul had a right to be supported. Paul, in fact, exercised that right by appealing back to the Macedonian churches to help pay for Paul's expenses. But again, knowing the Achaean culture, the culture along the Peloponnese and the southern part of Greece, knowing that culture and their desire to be thought of well, Paul wanted to bring a gift to them rather than bringing a product to them that they could buy and sell. Paul had a right to be supported. Jesus had the right to be worshiped. And what do we find that they did with those things? Frankly, nothing. right? That's the whole idea behind this idea of in Philippians chapter 2. Jesus had a right to be worshiped, but he set aside that right to be worshiped to come and be humiliated, to be killed on a cross in order to procure our salvation. Here's the creator of the universe who's willing to subject himself to death on our behalf. Paul, being an apostle of God, sent from God on a specific mission, he's an ambassador for God, has a right to be supported as an apostle. And yet he gives up that right so that they might have the free gift. Paul is very subtly comparing his motive from the depth of his heart back to the motive of Jesus, that he's doing it for free for their salvation, not as a product to sell. So as I mentioned, the Corinthians thought themselves as sponsors or benefactors of others, not as servant leaders. They sought their own exaltation, saying something like, people will create statues for us, or people will name streets and buildings after us. And that was actually the idea in Corinthian elite society. I mean, this is what they did. They paid for public works, and that's why you have streets named after so-and-so. Or you have, in fact, one of the very famous persons who paid for a public work became part of the church that's there. And you find an artifact that's still there today of a street named after him. And his name actually appears in the Corinthian letters as to, here's the guy who paid for something, but did away with it, and he became a believer. Right? The accepting of gifts in the ancient world created a social obligation to show gratitude. So if Paul reversed the situation, right, and he accepted the money from the Corinthians in the Corinthian society, then he would be obligated to somehow show them great praise for their magnificence and great empathy towards Paul's mission. And that's not what Paul's looking for at all. Paul had no problem with accepting a gift, and he did it from the brothers in Macedonia, after all. In the wisdom of God, it would create an obligation that placed Paul's mission as proceeding from God, being dependent upon I'll say this whole sentence again. In the wisdom of God, it would create an obligation that placed Paul's mission as proceeding from God to being dependent upon the goodwill of the Corinthians. In other words, Paul's trying to say, all these things that you're believing, draw attention to the fact that God is the sponsor of this mission. God is the sponsor of the mission to send Jesus. God's the sponsor of the mission to send the Holy Spirit. God's the sponsor of the mission to send Paul to you. And if we start accepting gifts and that puts us in an obligation somehow to give you praise for what's going on, now no longer do we praise God, but we praise you. And that's not the gospel we're bringing. Right? It wouldn't be God's mission any longer. It would be the Corinthians' mission. The Corinthians were given to accumulate honors and awards for themselves in the here and now. Which leads me to a point, now that everybody's here. What I always wrestle when I get to about this spot, about 2/3 done, 3/4 done with a session. What are we going to do next? Now that's a political fault that I have as well. I start looking to the next thing. Right. My career at the bank, I spent the last 2 years waiting for the last day. Because I had set a date, and that was going to be my date, and there was going to be nothing get in my way, and nothing did. You know, I praise the Lord for that, getting out just in time, given all the. I mean, I retired the week before COVID shut down everything. But at the same time, you can start looking too far advanced and then start losing track of your. This has been a good lesson for me personally. I see this in. Even some of the counseling sessions, people looking at the wrong thing. Having said all that as preparation, where I want to go next is in do a series through the end of the summer. I'm going to call it "What Happens When You Die," and people go, Do you know something I don't know? What are you saying? No, I think there's a whole aspect, and I'll say it this way: it's both personal eschatology, what happens to me personally, and then what's the order of events as revealed from Scripture. So we'll take a look at those kinds of things. So, what happens when you die? And we'll talk through all that. Now, I'll have copies of our doctrinal statement. We'll walk through that again. Doctrinal statement is just a recap of what the Scriptures have to say. So, what happens when you die will be next. And then I'm torn. I'm already looking past that one because that'll be to the end of summer. So I'm thinking either Galatians or Philippians or something from the Old Testament. So if you have opinions, drop me a note. And I may regard them. No, I think you've seen even the Second Corinthians was somebody's idea, and I think it's been a good lesson for me personally. So thank you. All right, so back to the awards here and now. So that was a subtle reflection on the Judgment Day and the Day of Rewards. So the Corinthians failed to appropriate to personally apply the example of self-chosen humiliation for the exaltation of others, which both Paul and Jesus did choose. The Corinthians were looking to exalt themselves compared to Jesus and Paul, who looked to almost debase themselves. They looked to humiliate themselves. That's a better word. They looked to place themselves not in need of somebody, but they looked to a place of needing to give somebody something, another gift. And the Corinthians, again, had this issue. You think about where 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, shows up. It shows up right in the middle of 2 chapters of gifts. And you don't, it doesn't take too much reading between the lines to get the idea that the Corinthians loved their gifts, that they could exercise on behalf of somebody else and make them grateful for what you've given them. They had the whole idea wrong. They used their gifts for encouraging somebody else to be grateful to them for using it. And that's where 1 Corinthians 13 comes into play, of using the gifts out of love, not for your own self-enjoyment or your own self-exaltation. What's that? Like a political, yeah, like a pact, yeah. So again, you can see the culture really coming into play in both first, and I don't think Martha, I think you suggested 2 Corinthians. I don't think I would have seen all that. Embroilment in the politics of it. But I appreciate that. So they wanted what they wanted for their own sake, not for the sake of others. They wanted what they wanted for their own exaltation, their own rights, not being willing to give up something for others. They allowed the culture and the civilization to inform them about what they thought, what they loved, and how they behaved. And that was really to their own shame. And you see that both in 1 and 2 Corinthians. Now, once again, this is an insinuation about the false or super apostles. They gladly exalted themselves and they gladly took money. They gladly mocked Paul for his wrong-headed views on accepting money, almost suggesting that Paul was really thinking that he knew he wasn't an apostle. He wasn't entitled to anything. In other words, Paul's putting on airs like, I've got this big mission, I'm on from God, as if he's covering up for something. And yet it was the false apostles or the super apostles that are saying, vacuous words and big fancy words and rhetorical style to cover up the fact that they knew nothing. You got these two styles we're comparing. So Paul's choice of the word for burden, then, when he says here again in chapter 12, brings with it the idea of being a freeloader or to live lazily off somebody else's generosity. He's using this words to talk about the false apostle. He's accusing the false apostles. He's kind of reversing the tables now. Now that he's set in stark contrast, the difference between him and his knowledge and his heart and his love for them, introducing them to Savior. And he's pointing out essentially the false apostles' desire for exaltation and money. And he talks about that he didn't want to be a burden. We'll come back to it in chapter 12 again, but he's essentially accusing them of being freeloaders and lazy. He's using the word shame he's using the word to shame the false apostles. Their requests, their demands are shakedowns. I mean, this is like protection money we're here to continue to proclaim these things to you, but you got to keep paying us. Otherwise, bad things could happen to you. It's really a shakedown. And by insinuation, then Paul is calling them lazy. All right, that brings us to verse 10, verses 10 and 11. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. If it is a sin or a mistake to preach the gospel free of charge, to accept no money, then it's something about which Paul would gladly boast, that he's willing to do that, just as Jesus had done. And really, this is a repetition of Paul's sentiment that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 15 to 18. He says, "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching, I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. This issue we find in 1 Corinthians, again, 3 or 4 years later, is still kind of there, and the false apostles are taking advantage of this. And yet what Paul's saying is that you have to understand my motive. Just ignore what the false apostles are saying. I won't be silenced, but I'm not going to be silenced because I want to bring you this gift. I want to bring you this gift that I love you and I'm willing to do without in order that you would have this free gift from God himself of the gospel of salvation. His final rhetorical question here, he says, I do not love you. And he asks in a great questioning manner, but it's rhetorical. He expects no, of course we know that you love us. And that's where it kind of sets, I got to think it sets the Corinthians back on their heels just a little bit, because now they're being accused of not loving, an echo of, again, 1 Corinthians 13. Paul knows it. Paul appeals to God as a witness, and we suspect that probably more of the Corinthians know it too. Again, by talking about the Corinthians en masse, it wasn't, I don't think, and this is my opinion from reading, it wasn't like every Corinthian was believing all these things. They just had a faction within the church, some who were essentially for Paul and for all the right reasons, and then some who were for the false apostles for all the wrong reasons. And you had these two competing factions. And Paul's writing to very much this group that's there, that's in danger of really not being saved. All right, on to verse 12 to 15, where we left off. And we'll read those 4 verses. And what I am doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission, they work on the same terms as we do. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. Paul will not be burdened by the social ills in the Corinthians. He won't help them with their self-esteem. He won't help them with their self-exaltation. He won't give in to the idea that the mission that he's on is the same as the mission they're on, that he's on the mission of God. He won't give in so that the mission of God is sidelined with the mission of the Corinthians or the mission of the super false apostles. Paul's going to continue on preaching the gospel in the same way and same manner he always has, so that God gets the glory, not the Corinthians themselves. They want to claim that they're apostles. Then Paul's really saying in this passage, let them work without pay, even as Jesus did, or as I do. Let them abandon the thought of serving themselves. Let them practice self-discipline and self-sacrifice. Let them stay a while and minister. Let them visit and write and give up sleep. Let them endure hardships and torture. And that's what the next chapter that we're going to read next week is going to be. Then we'll be on the same terms. Then we'll know that we're being the same apostles. Having established what they are, now we proclaim exactly how bad they are. And at this point, Paul unloads his most poignant and pointed accusations. He says they're boasters. Remember back in chapter 10, verses 13 and 15, but we will not boast beyond limits, but we'll boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us to reach even you. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged. Paul was only willing to boast in the fact that God had given him this area with these people with the gospel. He wasn't looking to come in and plow up somebody else's ground. He wasn't looking to take over somebody else's ministry. He wanted to go fresh, new places in order to bring the gospel free of charge. And he did this. And he's not taking any credit for doing anything beyond that, but other than saying, I did what God had me to do. But now he says that they boast just like they're Paul. That they are just like Paul, but he says that this is all false, that they're deceitful. The idea of being deceitful is the idea of it's a violation of a trust in an effort to deceive. They're treacherous. He says that they're disguised. And he says this in verse 13 and 14 and 15, that they feign to be, or they pretend to be someone who they're not. They disguise themselves as apostles, as an angel of light, as servants of righteousness. But in fact, they're none of these. Someone said they're professing Christians whom he roundly accuses of doing the devil's work. And they might have been believers, just listening benignly to the false apostles. But Paul's concerned that it might be more than that. You know, if you find someone who's in danger, who's in danger of drowning, for instance, you don't suddenly say, well, if you know how to swim, you're probably going to be okay. Even as they flail, right? You do all you can to rescue that person by throwing him a life, I want to say a life jacket or a ring or something. You do something in order to save them. You don't say, well, it'll probably be okay. I'll see you guys later. And then go off and do something else. Paul's that concerned that he doesn't let it just go to chance as to what can happen, but rather confronts the very source of the problem. And here's the issue. And again, as I mentioned before, it bears a strong resemblance to David and Goliath. These false apostles aren't just enemies of Paul, though they are that. Being aligned with Satan, they are enemies of God. They malign God's plan, his mission, and his purpose. This is where Paul's utter concern is coming from, is that while these are dastardly things, Paul's more concerned about God's glory being diminished because of that. Verse 16 down to verse 19, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast, for you will gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. And Paul returns to the idea of foolish boasting. The Corinthians have put up with this boasting without raising an eyebrow or pushing back. That's part of the main issue. Paul calls himself a fool. This self-deprecating remark is just like calling himself a slave, like he did very first part of the letter. He's not trying to elevate himself or to back into a compliment, but he does chide the Corinthians for bearing with the super apostles and their boasting. Verse 20, for if you bear it, if someone makes slaves of you or devours you or takes advantage of you or puts on airs or strikes you in the face, Paul's comments grow sharper here in pointing out the implications of their bearing with or putting up with these individuals. They are slaves to the false apostles. They're devoured. Another idea behind devoured is they're cheated. But they're cheated of any kind of recognition at that last day by God himself, because they're taking credit here and now. They're taken advantage of, or they're exploited. They put up with the airs that someone else exalts them. They put up with the airs that someone exalts themselves with. They're struck in the face. The church has been taken in as compared with their toleration of sin in their midst when they exalted themselves. Now the false apostles are the ones that are cheating, exploiting, exalting themselves, who are whipping the Christians. They seem to have lost the ability to discern. And the way that Paul expresses it, the church actually seems to enjoy it. And again, we saw this back in 1 Corinthians, where they put up with sin in their midst. Paul paints a picture of the rivals who are aggressive, acquisitive, authoritarian, and also attack others to build up their own authority. This is from David Garland. He makes that observation. Another commentator named Barrett says, human strength is known by its fruit, the acquisition of dignity and influence by those who possess it and use it. Divine power also is known by its fruit, the conversion of men and their building up of the new Christian society. So if you start to compare what Paul's doing and the fact that people come to the Lord and they walk with God and the Spirit dwells within them, and what the false apostles are doing, saying we're accumulating ourselves wealth and people who follow after us, right? It's not a comparison anymore. This is the one's God's ministry, the other one is not. But they're letting, the church is letting this happen to them. And then we come miraculously to the end of verse 21, or the beginning of verse 21. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. And we're going to stop there. But we come to this conclusion of this line of thinking. Paul is in almost tongue-in-cheek ashamed that he never acted that way. Now he's making fun of the Corinthians that he never did. He's not, you guys need to go. You guys are being palatial and bland. Chop. No, Paul's being patient with the Corinthians and almost tongue-in-cheek says, to my shame, I said, I must say that we were too weak for all that. He's really pointing out their differences to them. So next week, we'll continue on with the thought. We interrupt. That's kind of where the argument ends for that piece. Next week, we'll go on to chapter 12 and we'll stop at verse 10. So if you want, it's kind of a larger section, but again, the argument, I don't want to keep going over the same argument every week. Paul did that already. I want to kind of summarize that and we can kind of bring that to conclusion. Right. So what I hope you see is that the difference now between the Corinthian false apostles and between Paul's ministry and the accusations that are going on really back and forth. But Paul's concern is not for himself. Paul's concern is not for his 401k. He's not concerned for his money, his wealth, his houses. He's concerned about God's glory and God getting the honor. And he's bringing to the idea that the Corinthians are putting up with this, even by their own desire to be loved by these false apostles. It also highlights that we're always in danger of doing the same thing in our churches. We're always in danger of looking to be loved by those who even malign us. We're always in danger of being wanting to be appreciated by the gifts we give to somebody else. So wasn't it a nice thing wasn't it a nice shower we gave you? Shower's benign. It's a nice gesture. But when we start to exalt ourselves, saying we give the best showers, or we give the best gifts, or we have the best fellowship fund, or we have the best this or that, those things are worthy for God to get the glory, not for us as a church, but only not for God himself. Let's pray. Father, we do want to, with all we have, praise you and you alone. Guard our hearts from being like the Corinthians who listened to the false apostles, or even worse yet, being like the false apostles looking to gain our own exaltation at the expense of your glory. Father, in our midst, help us be mindful of any self-exaltation. Help us be self-aware when we're not giving you the glory. Again, that all of our works and all of our deeds would bring you praise, and you alone we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty. We will see you all in the funny papers.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, see you.
Bye.